So I would be working very, very hard on those two things. The third area, and it's going to be less important, but it's going to be important, is how do I continue to remove costs from the base business as I do that? Because volumes are going down, and so you're going to have the cost management standpoint. But that's going to be harder going forward than it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you sort of making this point around the sort of the strength of the competitors, because I'd sort of looked at, I mean, generally, Altria's market share trends have been very good in that cigarette business. It's only been over the last sort of 9 quarters or so that you've had this sort of slight wobble around Marlboro, and as you said, like the California was the big issue there.
Right.
So who do you think, who and what sort of poses the greatest threat in terms of Altria's market position?
Yeah, what changed though about, I forget the exact date that the transaction occurred, so, but it can be looked up easily. It's when when Reynolds purchased Lorillard and then sold the brands to Imperial. And while that didn't change the brands in the United States, what it did change is the brands being promoted and how they were promoted. So suddenly Newport could take advantage of Reynolds' nationwide scale. And so you didn't have Newport only being managed and promoted in places around the country. You had it promoted everywhere in the country, which was a hugely changed, dynamic, because Newport's a very strong brand. You had Campbell suddenly that could take advantage of Newport's distribution. Because remember, that was largely a regional brand too that suddenly became a national brand that had not been done before. So you suddenly had those two brands, which are very strong brands, have lots of new places that they suddenly appeared and promoted in lots of places that they hadn't been before. In addition, you then had Imperial pick up its portfolio of Winston and Kool, and they took those brands, which had largely been ignored when they were part of the Reynolds portfolio, and suddenly Winston on a national level became a real brand again and was priced at a very competitive levels where it hadn't been before. And Kool on regional levels suddenly became much more strongly promoted than it was before. And while those brands are not as strong as Campbell and Winston, they're still good brands. And so suddenly you have radically changed dynamics in the marketplace. Even though you went from 3 companies to still 3 companies, you had so many more brands being promoted and pushed than you did before, which I think ultimately is why the FTC approved the transaction, even though many people thought they wouldn't, because it actually made Reynolds a much bigger number 2 in the United States. Then, obviously, BAT came in and purchased Reynolds, and so suddenly you have 2 where you had a situation where the number 1, number 2, and number 3 in the United States market were all pure play domestic stocks. Now the number 2 and the 3 are actually subsidiaries of international companies, which gives them a lot more flexibility in terms of how they can think about delivering their financial returns to people, because before everybody had the same moat, the same marketplace, and the same dynamics, whereas now they don't. You have currency issues and other things like that make it a bit more difficult, I think, for Altria to figure out how to play against those 2 competitors than they did before, because of the brand portfolios, the geographic distributions, and the fact that they're owned by international competitors. So it's a much different profile than it was just 3 years ago.
Sure, but what's going to make it incrementally harder going forward, as it were? Because we've clearly had that effect.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily harder than it was over the last 12 to 18 months. But if you're comparing the previous 10 years versus the next 10 years, okay, that's the more comparison point I'm looking at.
No, totally. That makes total sense. It kind of just sounds that your view is that Altria is in a pretty tough spot from here.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Now, am I worried about the dividend growth or anything like that? No, I'm not. Depends on what you're looking at and what you want to do, but they're in a tougher competitive spot than they were just 2 or 3 years ago, for sure.
Yeah.